Becoming a parent is one of the most beautiful things on earth, raising your child into adulthood. Unless you're one of these kids' parents who just left them for the wolves to raise. As it turns out, feral children are a real thing, and maybe The Jungle Book wasn't based on a true story, but those type of stories are actually quite plentiful, and there was no shortage of them for this video. So if you want a part 2, let me know in the comments section. Feral children fall into two main categories to simplify this, but that's what informal history is, taking broad subjects and making them digestible. The first one is children who were raised in the wild, either by animals or just by themselves. Yes, there are actually children that were raised by wolves and monkeys, and we'll get into it. The second batch of feral children in the category are children who were just not socialized as children, maybe locked in a room for their entire life, just have no ability to speak or capacity for emotion, but we'll get into one of those as well. One of the less famous cases is the case of John Ssebunya. John Ssebunya was born in the 1980s in Uganda. Uganda is a part of Africa that is impoverished and sometimes doesn't have the best living conditions, and John Ssebunya had some of the worst living conditions you could ever imagine. In 1989, somewhere around the age of 4 or 5, just to tell you how different life is there, he didn't know how old he was. He ran away into the woods, but for good reason. John heard his parents fighting, bickering loudly, and then he heard the murder of his mother. Upon realizing it was his father that murdered his mother, he decided he didn't want to be the second victim, and he ran out of his house into the jungles of Uganda. Now keep in mind, the jungles of Uganda are a scary place, especially for a 4 or 5-year-old who doesn't have any survival skills. The venomous snakes and the lizards were the least of his concerns. The main concerns are, how's he going to get clean water? How is he going to get food? Keep in mind, Uganda, this isn't a place where you can just get clean water. There's cholera in the water basically everywhere. Plus, how are you going to eat? Most children don't know what they can forage for and what they can't. Never mind the mosquitoes and all the disease that those can give you. John lived in the jungle with a troop of monkeys for several years, and the way he survived was by mimicking the monkeys' behavior. He's foraging for food like roots, nuts, fruit, and other things that would be edible not only for a monkey, but for a human too. One of the best part about being raised by monkeys instead of wolves is they're gonna eat mostly what humans can eat too. The monkeys accepted John into their group, and he adapted with many of the characteristics, including moving on all fours and communicating through grunts and screeches. The monkeys seemed to form a great bond with John, taking them in as part of their family, because when a villager finally saw John and tried to rescue him, the monkeys tried to fend off the villager, throwing sticks and stones, which did not break the villager's bones, but incoherent grunts never hurt him or something. When John was found, he was malnourished and he had scars all over his body. And also, he was severely underdeveloped. Keep in mind, he's foraging for things, barely getting any food. Who knows, it could have been days on end that he wasn't eating. He also showed zero signs of interacting with humans. This is the characteristic of a feral child. They really want nothing to do with humans most of the time. John was taken to an orphanage that was run by missionaries. He began his rehabilitation, and over time he was able to learn language and improve his motor skills, and he reintegrated into society. The progress was slow, but this is the only feral child story you're ever going to hear that had such great results. Usually, children who don't learn language in the first 5 or 6 years of their life never ever do. Even as adults, even with the best speech therapists, they almost never learn any sort of language, and even the bond between them and humans almost never forms. The craziest part about the story is John eventually learned how to sing so well that he's with a traveling choir. John is still alive today, although we don't know his exact whereabouts. It seems like he integrated perfectly well into society, and judging by the next couple stories, you'll see why that is so remarkable. Perhaps the most well-documented case is Victor of Aveyron. His story took place in the 18th and early 19th century in France. He was one of the very first feral children to be studied in the modern age, where we could judge development, language acquisition, and the efforts to reintroduce these kids into society. Victor was first spotted in the forests of southern France around 1797, and over the next few years, on multiple occasions, he was seen again and again, but finally in 1800, something happened. Victor was finally captured. He was believed to be about 12 years old, although he looked like he was probably quite a bit younger. When he was found, he was naked, he was filthy, and he was not able to speak. He seemed rather accustomed to living in the wild, and he survived by foraging for food like roots and acorns. He had almost no social behaviors, even the basics, and he seemed like he didn't mind the cold at all, had zero reaction to it. It seemed like he wasn't raised by animals, but instead he lived alone in the forest for several years. It's not even clear exactly when or why he became separated from society, although it is possible that he had a developmental disability, and it's likely that his parents just decided not to interact with him and leave him in the woods to go. This is something that unfortunately was rather common around this time, where it would be seen as shameful to your family to have a child that had some sort of disability like this. He was nonverbal, he wanted complete solitude, he wanted nothing to do with other humans, didn't know how to look other people in the eye, and had zero language. What's interesting is his smell and his hearing were very acute, much more than most other humans. Keep in mind, he was in the woods for who knows how long, and this is just a survival skill that he developed naturally. Upon capture, he was taken to Paris, and this is a place where a young physician, Jean-Marc Gaspard, took him in and became deeply interested in the case. Itard was convinced that with proper training, Victor could learn and communicate and integrate into society. So an educational program was put in place just for Victor, and it was focused on mostly teaching him language, empathy, and social skills. Simple things like associating a word with an object, the same sort of way you'd actually train things like chimpanzees or gorillas. But he only learned a few words, and there was really limited success and very limited progress. But he was taught some social behaviors, like understanding basic commands and then recognizing other humans. Victor also had a caretaker who it seemed like he had an emotional bond with, and this was really interesting because it showed that he wasn't void of the capacity to show emotion. Entire theories and hypotheses were developed from this case. The critical period hypothesis is a theory that suggests there is a window during early childhood when the brain is most receptive to learning language. This hypothesis seems to come true in a lot of these cases where these kids are found at early ages but just never grasp language. This also might be able to explain why young children can learn a second or third language so much easier when they're younger than someone like you or I who are not young. Unfortunately, Victor fell into obscurity, and around 1828, he passed away. The next one is rather heartbreaking, and I can make a whole video about it if you let me know in the comment section. This one it was kind of a hard read, honestly. This woman's name is Genie. In the 1970s in Los Angeles, Genie was found, and it was nothing short of torture. Genie wasn't raised by wolves or in the woods. She was raised in a home. Well, a room of a home, with no lights and nothing in it except for a potty and a bed. Genie was subject to extreme abuse and isolation by her father, Clark Wiley. Clark believed that she was mentally disabled and in turn locked her up in a small room, often strapped to a potty chair and confined to a sleeping bag. This restricted her movement to the point where when she was found, she couldn't really move her body like a normal human. There were times where she would be strapped to this potty for days on end, at least 13 hours a day, and when she was not confined to the sleeping bag at night, she was strapped to a crib. The windows were completely blacked out, there was next to nothing to actually touch in that room, and the only sounds that she heard were from outside because her brother and her mother were also not allowed to say a single word. In fact, if Genie or the other humans in the house were to make a noise, the father would become very aggressive, very abusive, and if it was Genie that was making the noise, he would stand on the other side of the door and bark at her like a dog. In 1970, when Genie was 13, her mother Irene Wiley finally fled her abusive husband and sought help from social services. This gets a little bit muddy, but her mother was almost completely blind and turned out she walked into the wrong building, and that's how Genie was found in the first place. The case came to light. They couldn't believe that Genie was much older than she looked. She looked like she was 7 or 8 years old based on her size and the fact that she looked like she was maybe very autistic. That's what the theory was when she was found because she was so developmentally delayed. Her movement was bizarre and her behavior was almost animal-like according to reports. The good news is she was discovered and she was put into care of physicians and linguists. The bad news is they treated her like an experiment. And despite extensive efforts, Genie never fully acquired normal language skills. And although she bonded with some of the caretakers, her behavior was described as withdrawn or detached. There was intense media and academic attention, and this brought up the question, are the scientists studying Genie for her benefit or exploiting her as a subject? Not all things last, and by the end of the 1970s, people got bored of this. She wasn't really getting anywhere, and a lot of her support system just crumbled. She became a ward of the state, but later on her mother took over her care once again, and then in the early 2000s, the last reports that we could find of her, she was living in a private care facility, but again, she's still very clearly different than other humans her age. Let me know in the comments section below if you liked this. Do you want to hear more about raised by animals or maybe the abusive one? Let me know. I'd love to make another video just like this one. Please do hit the like and subscribe button, and as always, I do videos every weekend, so I'll see you in the next one.